Our event today features an observer of our city. We are being watched in many parts of the world, including Paris, where our guest, Professor Andrew Diamond, is often featured in the French media to speak about what is happening in urban America, in particular Chicago. Andrew Diamond is Professor of American History and Civilization at the University of Paris-Sorbonne. He is the author of numerous books and articles on race and politics in the metropolitan United States, including Mean Streets, Chicago Youth, and the Everyday Struggle for Empowerment in the Multiracial City, 1908 through 1969, and the forthcoming book, City on the Make, Race and Inequality in Chicago. Professor Diamond, in his remarks, is going to focus on the way that politics lies at the center of Chicago's history and of understanding its conditions of race and inequality. Coupled with Andrew's view from the outside, so to speak, on our panel, responding to him, we have asked two longtime political veterans to share with us the benefits of their experience and their insights. During the 1960s, Don Rose was active in the civil rights movement, serving as the Midwest States organizer for the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and later as press secretary to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during his Chicago campaign. In 1968, he was an organizer and spokesman for the National Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam. In 1980, he was an organizer of the short-lived Citizens Party and was political director in 1992 of the National Committee to draft Mario Cuomo for president. For many years, Don Rose has been a political consultant and writes a weekly column for the Chicago Daily Observer, which won the Chicago Journalists Association Award for commentary in 2010. Don is one of those people who really cares about the world he lives in, and he has fought for years to be part of a progressive set of policies and politics to change the world. His analysis is sharp, clear, focused, and we look forward to hearing his thoughts. Thank you, Don Rose, for being here today. In some ways, Jesus Garcia needs no introduction. For the record, he is affectionately known far and wide as Chewy. Currently a Cook County Commissioner, Chewy Garcia recently announced his candidacy for mayor of our great city of Chicago. He is an alumna and longtime friend of UIC, receiving his BA here and his master's degree in urban planning and policy. Several months ago, when we were putting this panel together, we thought of Chewy because he has long been involved in the politics of this city, starting as a firebrand alderman during the era of the late Mayor Harold Washington, and then serving for several years as an Illinois state senator, after which he became executive director of Enlace, one of the city's leading community development agencies. 4 years ago, he decided to enter the political arena as a county commissioner. Known as a progressive with a strong set of convictions, Commissioner's mayoral campaign will offer an interesting counterpoint of view in the upcoming 2015 election. For today, we look to him both from his living history as a Latino leader in a city that has a national reputation for marginalization and segregation of its people of color, and to give us his analysis as to where he sees us going as a people and a community in this city of big shoulders. Commissioner Garcia, we are glad that you could be here with us today. And by the way, Don is advising Chewy on his campaign, just full disclosure, and when we set up this panel, we had no idea that anyone was running, but there again, here we are. So it's a treat to have them both here as veterans of the political history of the city of Chicago. Also joining the panel is Professor Pauline Lippman, who is Professor of Educational Policy Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Her newest book is entitled The New Political Economy of Urban Education, Neoliberalism, Race, and the Right to the City. We look forward to Pauline's many insights that also stem from her advocacy work around education and school closings. Andrew and Pauline knew each other in the 90s, and so we are pleased that Pauline could join us. Thank you, Pauline, for being here. Rounding out our panel is Victor Dixon, who is President and CEO of the SAFER Foundation, one of the nation's largest not-for-profit providers of employment, placement, and job readiness training exclusively for people with criminal records. Mr. Dixon has more than 25 years of experience in leadership roles in both corporate and nonprofit arenas. Victor, we genuinely appreciate your work and the time that you are spending with us today. Professor Diamond, welcome to Chicago. We will begin first with Professor Diamond's remarks, after which we will open then up the conversation with our panelists. So with that, Professor?
Thank you, and thank you to the organizers for having me. And I just want to correct one thing before I start. I've been introduced as a kind of Alexis de Tocqueville, but I was a resident of Chicago for 6 years. I know about the city sticker, and I know what a Chicago winter is like and what a Chicago heat wave is like. So let me just. Oops. Okay, so I've written what I think is a new history of Chicago. And my decision to take on the challenge of casting Chicago's post-World War II history in a new light emerged out of the conviction that the history of this Midwestern metropolis reveals some essential dimensions of the past, present, and future of the urban United States. In this, I follow in the footsteps, of course, of a number of renowned historians and sociologists who have gravitated towards Chicago out of some idea that the city provided a compelling case study that could be applied elsewhere, and who for the most part took the city's generalizability for granted. In particular, Chicago's post-war history was on the surface emblematic of the Rust Belt story of deindustrialization and ghettoization that William Julius Wilson had helped move to the center of the debate on the black inner-city poor in the 1980s. But Chicago's trajectory was also quite distinct as well. In 1990, it remained, along with Gary and Detroit, near the top of the list of the 10 most segregated cities in the country, 8 of which were typical Rust Belt cities. But it was really the only one among the group that could be considered a first-tier global city. Indeed, if Chicago's segregation rate was certainly comparable to other Rust Belt cities, it combined characteristics that sharply distinguished it from the rest: a robust economy of tourism, a thriving downtown business district, a large fire industries sector, finance, insurance, real estate, and an internationally recognized brand name, among others. What better place, then, to explore the questions of inequality and marginality? Since French economist Thomas Piketty's instant classic, Capital in the 21st Century, a 700-page book by a French economist that happened to make it to #1 on the Amazon bestseller list, strange times we live in. Since the publication of this book, one could say we have been paying a bit more attention to the problem of inequality. And I see my work as contributing to the larger project of understanding the historical origins of our current situation of dramatic inequality. Between the mid-1960s and the present day, the United States has witnessed a spectacular redistribution of wealth upwards. In 1968, the richest 1% of Americans took home 8% of the national income. Today, the top 1% earns about 25% of the national income and controls over 40% of the nation's wealth. This was a breathtaking transformation that required a massive shift in values and attitudes, a shift that was ushered in by a conservative ascendancy that effectively rallied Americans around ideals of individualism, meritocracy, and free market supremacy. Perhaps the most important objective of my work, then, is to view this shift within the confines of a single city, a city whose paradigmatic nature is legendary. Such an objective implicates this project within a debate among political scientists and geographers that began around 2002, when Michael Deere claimed that the so-called Los Angeles School of Urbanism is more paradigmatic than the Chicago School for understanding the evolution of the metropolitan U.S. Deere's argument rested on the idea that the Chicago School's spatial logic of a centrally organized modernist city, in which the economic and political activities of the central business district organize the surrounding metropolitan region, is now outdated. Much more prototypical, rather, is the kind of sprawl and fragmentation exhibited by Los Angeles. Nor was this merely a question of urban form. Proponents of the Los Angeles School claim that scholars who focused on Chicago were rendering themselves blind to rising levels of inequality and ethno-racial conflict associated with the postmodern, decentered spatial logic of Los Angeles. Such critiques provoked a strong reaction among researchers working on Chicago who were proud of their city, a number of whom came together to establish what they called the new Chicago School of Urbanism. While most of these political scientists and sociologists concurred that the Chicago model of concentric rings around a central business district needed to be replaced by a more metropolitan framework, they reasserted the relevance of Chicago's model by arguing that, quote, the city center is critical and that public services are a core organizing element in such a global city, unquote. Another fundamental point of agreement among the school scholars, moreover, was that while global forces, while globalization has had a strong impact on the city's evolution, the local political structure from the neighborhood level up to City Hall continues to play a major role in determining how the city develops and how it is governed. Politics, as two of the school's leading proponents put it, still matters, and it does in other cities as well. So politics, broadly defined, lies at the center of my new work on Chicago. And politics, for my purposes, is not merely something that happens during elections, city council sessions, and the meetings of labor unions and a range of other political and civic organizations. Politics transpires around kitchen tables, on street corners, in parks and corner bars, around schools, at block meetings, and in nearly every place in which people come together to share their stories, discuss important issues to them, and ultimately to form ideas about themselves, their neighbors, their neighborhood, and their city. Such an approach unavoidably steers us onto the terrain of the cultural, for it is here that average residents of the city most commonly engage in these activities. There is no better example of the power of culture, I think, to shape politics than the 1983 campaign that culminated in the election of Chicago's first black mayor, Harold Washington, when Chicagoans articulated the contest not as one between two candidates with different policies, but rather as a Manichaean struggle between opposing visions of our way of life. Yet in a city where hotly contested elections are, as we know, more the exception than the rule, culturally inflected struggles have since the 1940s most commonly manifested themselves in spatial terms, at the boundaries, both geographic and cultural, between different communities. Chicagoans, as I highlight, have been very active in forming communities and defining their neighborhoods to reflect their social identities, cultural predilections, and lifestyles. Chicago has, throughout the post-World War II era, consisted of a patchwork of neighborhoods that have been largely produced by the people residing within them. And the activities that have gone into their creation and maintenance have constituted vital sources of political participation that have energized grassroots political organizations, cultural associations, block clubs, groups, and aldermanic campaigns. Nor have these activities been limited to the neighborhood level. The efforts of Chicagoans to define and preserve the cultural identities of their communities have had a powerful impact on City Hall. From the grassroots anti-integration campaigns of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, to the Black and Latino drives for local autonomy and cultural recognition in the 1960s and 1970s, to the more recent efforts of middle-class residents to promote the gentrification and thus middle-class character of their neighborhoods. Now, these stories have been told before, but few historians have attempted to fit them all within one sweeping framework that carries the narrative through Chicago's rise to global city stature. City on the Make thus attempts to break new ground by providing a multi-layered history of Chicago that fits within the same frame the micro-histories of neighborhood formation and evolution and the macro-histories of municipal politics and of the structural transformations wrought by capitalist globalization. Yet no less fundamental to my project is an attempt to highlight the importance of historical legacies in shaping the policies, political possibilities, and structural changes of the present. I'm interested here and today, I think, in bringing a historical perspective to the possibilities and constraints of our present political culture, of understanding what produced the political culture we've inherited and must operate within today. Traversing a century-long period that culminates in the present moment, which historians seldom do, my work endeavors to make a new contribution to ongoing reflections on the history of the present for Chicago and of the urban U.S. in general. It seeks to accomplish what historian Joan Scott has defined as the crucial burden of this project, to unearth the historical processes behind structures, policies that appear inevitable, natural, or culturally necessary. Engaging in this form of critical inquiry in the case of Chicago means running up against two essential dimensions of Chicago's past that continue to circumscribe the political possibilities of the present. One, the long history of racial segregation and inequality that has divided the city into impoverished black ghettos, affluent white neighborhoods, and interstitial spaces inhabited mostly by a mix of Latinos, immigrants, and whites. And two, the more than 4 decades of autocratic rule under Mayor Richard J. Daley, then Richard M. Daley, that has shaped the city's political culture and modes of governance. Few things seem more natural to Chicagoans today than racial segregation and autocratic mayors. These two interlocking strands guide this history of Chicago, and in this it is hardly unique. Much has been written about the municipal policies and institutional forces that made Chicago into one of the most segregated cities in the United States, beginning with Arnold Hirsch's classic, Making the Second Ghetto, in 1983. In fact, what made Hirsch's work path-breaking nearly 3 decades ago was that it added a grassroots dimension to our understanding of post-war ghettoization, revealing that powerful community movements against racial integration played a major part in reinforcing black segregation in the post-war years. Working-class Chicagoans, as Hirsch revealed, took to the streets with tactics of terrorism and civil disobedience to defend the whiteness of their communities, thereby pressuring their political leaders to oppose any measures, for example, racially integrated public housing projects, that would introduce black residents into their neighborhoods. But Hirsch's framework leaves crucial aspects of the post-war political scene untouched. As my study argues, the vigorous anti-integration opposition Hirsch describes turned Chicago into a racial backlash city years before most of urban America. And the Daley machine deftly negotiated this white backlash while maintaining solid support among African Americans. That was the magic of Richard J. Daley, as he was able to negotiate both sides of the color line in that period. Daley made sure to always take a seemingly neutral, non-ideological stance to any racial issues that arose while distributing just enough patronage resources to black Chicago's civic and political leadership. Moreover, the spread of a siege mentality among working-class whites in a city run by an increasingly authoritarian mayor created the conditions for a wave of political repression that crippled the city's progressive forces and stunted the development of a formidable progressive political culture. Hence, the process of ghettoization not only produced a certain spatial arrangement, which we all know today, but it also produced modes of governance, ideologies, and feelings that would have a strong impact on Chicago's political scene during the pivotal era of minority empowerment movements in the 1960s and 70s. Some of these ideologies and feelings would, for example, shape how the city's expanding Latino communities would view their status and place in the city, White Chicagoans, I should remind us, were not the only ones to take to the streets for the cause of racial exclusion. Mexicans and Puerto Ricans as well engaged in what Robert Orsi has referred to as strategies of alterity, to distance themselves from their black neighbors and from each other. A phenomenon revealed most strikingly in the violent fighting gang subcultures of the West Side in that era, where young blacks, whites, Puerto Ricans, and Mexicans engaged in a war of attrition over turf in the 1960s and 1970s. The divisive racial politics of this era explains a great deal, I think, about why progressive forces in Chicago were virtually powerless against the prerogatives of the global city agenda that deprived black and Latino communities of jobs, services, resources, and power since the 1990s. These are facets of the urban historiography that have seldom, if ever, appeared in the same narrative. And this is due in part to the fact that historians of the urban United States have, by and large, avoided wide-ranging studies of major cities over the longue durée, especially those dealing extensively with the 1990s and first decade of the 21st century. Indeed, historians have hardly scratched the surface of the metropolitan United States in the high era of globalization after the 1970s. Too many political histories of the post-war metropolitan U.S. have taken the Reagan Revolution as the endpoint of a story about the conservative ascendancy, a story that brings us to an analysis of the Republican Party rather than about political culture in general. By continuing the story into the era of new democratic centrism, we get a much different idea of the circumstances that have produced our current political configuration and of its incapacity, both locally and nationally, to tackle problems of race and inequality. City on the Make thus purports to contribute to the broader project of tracing the evolution of urban societies during the neoliberal moment of capitalism that began in the 1970s. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what that means as the paper goes on. I'll define what I mean by the neoliberal moment and neoliberalization. More specifically, I build upon the work of Eric Kleinenberg, who wrote a fantastic book about the Chicago heat wave of 1995 that I recommend to everyone here, and Mary Patillo, professor at Northwestern, on the social, political, and cultural consequences of Chicago's transformation into an entrepreneurial state, characterized by deregulation, fiscal austerity, the outsourcing of vital city services, and the promotion of market solutions to public problems. Like these sociologists, my own research suggests that any investigation into Chicago politics today must grapple with the aggressive neoliberal program engineered by Richard M. Daley's administration in the 1990s and first decade of the 21st century. However, my own account takes the analysis of Chicago's neoliberal turn in three somewhat new directions. First, as perhaps the first book-length historical analysis of the impact of neoliberalism at the grassroots over the relatively long durée of a century, City on the Make contributes a historical intervention in a field thus far dominated by sociologists, geographers, and political scientists. The Reagan Revolution's neoliberal takeover in the 1980s did not happen overnight, but rather culminated out of a pre-existing ideological and cultural groundwork that was decades in the making, which we need to understand more about. While scholars like David Harvey have traced the origins of the neoliberal turn back to the mid-1970s, the critical moment for the takeoff of neoliberalization, according to many, my research on Chicago uncovers the roots of neoliberal hegemony back in the 1950s. Indeed, if the guiding principles of neoliberalism are the supremacy of the free market, the withdrawal of the state from welfare provision and redistributive social justice, and the sanctity of private property and privatized services, then Chicago was in the throes of neoliberalization for most of Richard J. Daley's more than 2 decades in office. Beginning in the late 1950s, when he turned over the task of planning the city's future development to an alliance of downtown business interests, Boss Daley presided over a municipal government that moved key policy decisions out of the hands of the public and into corporate boardrooms. In Daley's Chicago, a federally funded urban renewal program that was intended to uplift the poor ended up subsidizing downtown development projects that reinforced the walls around the Black Ghetto. It was Richard J. and not Richard M. Daley, moreover, who brokered the deals that built the John Hancock Center, the Sears Tower, and many of the other iconic skyscrapers that launched Chicago into the global age. All this while large parts of the south and west sides were turning into hyperghettos. In fact, what many historians have overlooked is the extent to which the global city agenda of the 1990s actually came together in the 1960s under Richard J. Daley, who understood that the future lay in keeping corporate capital from leaving the city for the suburbs. Neoliberalism, political scientist Wendy Brown reminds us, prescribes not a non-interventionist state, hence the neo prefix, but rather an interventionist one, an interventionist in the sense that it seeks to unleash market forces and promote governance that places business leaders in the driver's seat. Richard J. Daley's administration certainly did this. Second, unlike most scholars working on the neoliberal turn, my analysis places the local politics of race at the center of the story. Now, I think this lack of attention to racial dynamics by those who are interested in the neoliberal turn is due to the fact that few urbanists have been very interested in historicizing what I call the long march to neoliberalization, from below, at the grassroots. Quote, "Economics are the method," Margaret Thatcher once remarked, "but the object is to change the soul." In other words, to view neoliberalism too narrowly as simply a policy regime that rose to prominence beginning in the mid-1970s around the world is to misunderstand how much its triumph rested upon the construction of what David Harvey has referred to as, quote, "a market-based populist culture of differentiated consumerism and individual libertarianism," a culture, a political culture. My work seeks to show that racial issues often played crucial roles in changing the souls of many Chicagoans, and that the politics of race, in effect, pulled the residents into the political sphere and shaped feelings, sensibilities, and ideas that socialized the generation that came of age in the 1970s and 1980s, thereby paving the way for the acceptance of neoliberal forms of governance. This was a multifaceted phenomenon, to say the least. On the one hand, it involved the development of forms of reactionary populism in the neighborhoods among working-class Chicagoans who rose up to defend their neighborhoods against racial integration between the 1940s and 1970s. In grassroots movements against racially integrated public housing projects, for instance, and against the Black Drive for civil rights, white Chicagoans articulated languages of anti-statism, consumer rights, and individualism that shaped a nascent neoliberal political culture in their neighborhoods. On the other hand, it also involved the kind of identity politics that emerged out of the minority empowerment struggles of the 1960s and 70s. And here the link between race and neoliberalization becomes a bit complicated, but no less pertinent. For one thing, the politics of racial identity, which served as a powerful means for mobilization, the civil rights movement, the Latino movements for empowerment in the 1960s and 70s, undermined potentially broad-based rainbow coalitions for reform and social justice. For another, the politics of race and recognition came to be powerfully incorporated into Richard M. Daley's neoliberal project in the 1990s. Unlike his father, and the joke back then was that Richard J. Daley considered affirmative action to be 8 Irishmen and a Swede. Unlike Richard J. Daley, Richard M. Daley understood the importance of the politics of recognition for different ethno-racial communities throughout the city. And he bestowed this recognition in the forms of strategic minority appointments within his administration and official acknowledgement of the physical boundaries and cultural significance of key ethno-racial neighborhoods. Daley always made sure, for example, to position minorities within leadership roles over the city's school system and public housing agency, 2 departments that aroused great controversy in Black and Latino Chicago. And it was Daley who financed the placement of massive iron flags at each end of the Paseo Boricua in the traditional heart of Puerto Rican Chicago, and who promoted the transformation of Mexican Pilsen into a major tourist destination. Such policies enabled Mayor Daley to create local brokers and middlemen whose ethno-racial legitimacy allowed them to advance the larger neoliberal agenda, especially in the form of pro-gentrification and pro-tourism policies that have worked to the disadvantage of renters and public housing residents. Along with the new economy of tourism, the gentrification imperative has driven a range of policies that have ushered in neoliberal sensibilities and forms of governance. It has given private developers a larger role in the planning process, transformed more and more homeowners into individualistically minded investors, and investors in their home, and turned many middle-class Chicagoans against public housing and other state programs that appear to threaten their property values. All these circumstances City on the Make seeks to demonstrate created a new logic of class conflict in the city. The last 3 decades have seen class and property gradually eclipsing race and ethnicity as the most powerful determinants of political interests and identities. What is somewhat new about this is the fact that the politics of identity now serve to obscure the class dynamics and interests in play within minority communities. Hence, even in Black Chicago, where due to the long history of ghettoization, feelings of shared destiny are perhaps strongest, class tensions have been sharply on the rise since the early 1990s. As Mary Patillo's research on Black gentrification has shown, even when Black middle-class residents are assuming roles as race leaders and acting in ways they feel will uplift their poorer neighbors, they often end up promoting a middle-class agenda that has opposite effects. My analysis of Chicago's gentrification frontier over the past few decades extends this perspective of Patillo's into Mexican and Puerto Rican communities as well, revealing how, a middle-class, pro-development agenda has frequently been clothed in appeals to ethno-racial solidarity and pride since the early 1990s. The groundwork for this situation was laid down, and here we need to look at history, during the 1960s and 70s, when African American, Mexican, Puerto Rican communities took to the streets to inscribe their ethno-racial identities within the city's social geography. Involving predominantly working-class residents, these identity-based struggles were difficult to disentangle from struggles for social justice. However, by the 1990s, I think, neoliberalization had irreparably ruptured the link between ethno-racial identity and social justice, a situation that turned the traditional politics of identity on its head. In the Mexican community of Pilsen and the Puerto Rican community of Humboldt Park, for example, many of those who advanced claims to ethnocultural identity in the crucial decade after the mid-1990s tended to be aligned with the Daley administration and its project to take back the city for the middle class, while organizations fighting against the displacement of low-income residents by gentrification increasingly replaced exclusionary ethno-racial rhetoric of old with more universalist languages of social justice and class. Class, I think, has resurfaced as the idiom of minority militants in Chicago, not merely on the gentrification frontier, but also in the context of insurgent campaigns waged in the last few years by teachers and services workers. And yet, it would be misleading to overstate the case for a resurgent left in Daley's final years in office. If the whole labor movement finally turned against Daley in 2007, with the Chicago Federation of Labor not endorsing an incumbent mayor for the first time in its history, it was much too little, too late. The fact is that Richard M. Daley ruled over a city of stark inequality and frequent corruption scandals for 22 years without ever having to wage a serious election campaign. In his last election in 2007, overall voter turnout barely surpassed 30%, with 70% of blacks and 80% of Latinos casting their votes for him. His father, moreover, was nearly as invulnerable. Although his popularity was waning towards the end of his career, it took a heart attack to remove him from City Hall. In sum, in the 55 years between the first election of Richard J. Daley and the end of Richard M. Daley's last term, it was only during the 13-year interregnum when a Daley did not occupy the mayor's office that Chicago could be said to have possessed a truly democratic political culture. Viewing this quiescence, this political silence, as a manifestation of the neoliberal turn and its brand of racial politics constitutes the third new perspective that City on the Make brings to our understanding of urban history and politics. Political scientist Wendy Brown has highlighted the de-democratizing force exerted by neoliberal forms of reasoning and governance, arguing that the business approach to governing and the market rationality that characterize neoliberalism militate against democratic governance and a democratic political culture. In Chicago, however, the de-democratizing effects of neoliberalization have been augmented by a political context that has worked to attribute many of the city's most pressing issues, gang-related murders, drug trafficking, failing public schools, high minority unemployment and poverty rates, to cultural rather than political causes. Mahmoud Mamdani has referred to this process as the culturization of politics, the transfer of political acts and events onto the terrain of culture, where they become dissociated, disconnected from questions of structure, power, and ultimately political mobilization. This is not to say, however, that the city did not muster some robust political opposition to the political establishment, most notably during the minority empowerment challenges of the 60s, and then again in the 1980s with the breathtaking story of the election of the city's first black mayor behind a program of sweeping reform. These are indeed important stories within my broader narrative, but my focus in relating them involves not only how they emerged, which is important, but also why they ultimately failed in their objectives. In short, I'm interested in how the political culture of the city was incapable of sustaining progressive reform challenges, a situation that had a great deal to do with the depoliticizing effects of neoliberalization and of cultural racism. And in this, I think Chicago is a lot like many other cities. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic. A couple of business items before I turn to our panelists. One, I want to acknowledge Bob Jordan, who's here, WGN. We hope to have some partnering work with Bob in some of our neighborhoods. Thank you, Bob, for being here. Also, I want to acknowledge Professor Dick Simpson, longtime observer of politics and former alderman in the city of Chicago. I also want to let you know that you will have an opportunity to ask questions. In a couple of minutes, some folks will pass around cards, so you can be writing your question on the card, and then we will take the cards from you and get as many questions in as we can. And then finally, I want to let you know that we have folders on your chairs that are part of our little gift to you, and inside those folders, besides the agenda, is some information on Great Cities, but also the information about our hashtag for this event. So for those of you who like to tweet, hashtag Great Cities, and ours, our address is at Great Cities. Or no, it's at UIC GCI, sorry. But anyway, that information is there for you. So, okay, Andrew, you've certainly put forward a lot of interesting ideas for us and weaved a thread of analysis that poses a way of thinking about why we are in these conditions of inequality. So I first want to give a chance to our panelists to respond to some of what they heard, and then I've got some particular questions that I want to put forward. So Don Rose, if I can begin with you, longtime political observer. What are your thoughts in reaction to Professor Diamond?
Well, let's begin with the fact that this has been two cities from the very beginning, from the time they chased the Indians out of Fort Dearborn. Many of us learned that the father of Chicago was a guy named John Kinsey. I don't know who went to school here. He was the father of Chicago. It turns out he was a rum runner who sold rum to the Indians. It was probably 20 years later that I learned that the first settler of Chicago was a black man named Jean DuSable, Pontice DuSable. The segregation of our city began long ago, and we can take one big chunk right at the in the late 40s when the National Housing Act was passed to create public housing, and the Chicago City Council immediately passed a law, an ordinance that said that the aldermen had to approve public housing buildings. So the black aldermen, wanting these were guys who were very much associated with the administration. The black aldermen wanted as many constituents as they could get, so they took all the public housing, and the white aldermen, for the most part, said no thank you. Now that's set in concrete, partly, substantially, the segregation of the city. Federal policies for housing and redevelopment were also as racist as they come. You look back at some of them, and they literally said, you know, poor colored over there, but we'll finance the circle around it. Now, Richard J. Daley used every instrumentality of government, the police department, the planning department, the public housing, the schools, to segregate and maintain segregation in the city. And each and every one of those, over the next, say, 15 years, was found guilty of either constitutional or civil rights violations, but the pattern had been set. Now, let's look at what's happened since. We all used to say, let's tear down the public housing. Let's get rid of those high-rise ghettos. Well, okay, so they redistributed a few people into some suburbs and into some outlying neighborhoods, and they tore all down many, many public housing developments. But they did not provide the alternative of low-income housing for those residents. Now, was that an accident? No, it was a depopulation strategy. That's why Chicago has lost something like 200 African Americans in the last, roughly in the last decade. The stratagems for reducing African American power are infinite, and they keep going on. I don't want to take up a whole lot of time, but let me just give you an example. Back in the 60s and 70s, one of the reforms we thought that might be useful was to have a nonpartisan mayoral election, so that somebody like, let us say, a Jim Thompson, who was then a federal prosecutor with, you know, great credentials and so on before he became governor, could go on a ballot without having the stigma of Republican next to his name in a partisan primary election. Well, they kept the partisan elections until somebody named Harold Washington won a simple plurality in a partisan election, made him a Democrat, and he almost got beat, but he couldn't get beat because he was a Democrat in the city of Chicago. Well, very soon after that, they said, we can't have any more Harold Washingtons doing that, so we got now a nonpartisan election, which my friend here is going to win soon. That nonpartisan election, had it been in 1983, Harold Washington would have been defeated in the runoff by Jane Byrne. He had only won by 2 votes, by 2% over Jane Byrne, or maybe 3%, but it's very clear that he would have lost a runoff. So they took the reform of 1970 to use as a racial instrument in what I think this is the 2nd or 3rd election that we're now using nonpartisan. Just one other note about inequality. I could go on and on like this, as most of people have heard me know. I just want to make one more point about how inequality starts happening way, way back. In the old days when we had a lot of patronage, of course patronage, as you know, is dead in Chicago. When we had a lot of patronage, the boss, the plantation boss of the South Side was a guy named Bill Dawson. Name may be familiar to anybody over 55 maybe. Dawson had an interesting strategy. He wanted people, just as he wanted people in in the high rises. He wanted as big a constituency as he could get. And they would all have patronage jobs available. And let's say Dawson got a $20,000 a year. This was big money at the time. Let's say you got a $20,000 a year lawyer's job. Did he give it to some African-American lawyer of consequence? Maybe once in a while, but mostly what he would do was trade his $20,000 a year lawyer's job with some committeeman from the Northwest Side who had $4,000 or $5,000 a year garbage picker's job. And so the shift took place there. The African-American committeeman got his $4,000, $5,000 a year jobs, and the committeeman up in Ward 40, whatever, got a $20,000 a year job. We talk about income inequality as if it were something relatively new. It's been going on, and it's been institutionalized even before we knew what neoliberalism was. Before I go on and on, I better pass.
Commissioner Garcia, there have been moments over these years when there have been various kinds of responses to these conditions. 28 years ago, 1986, we had some redistricting elections. It was a very important moment in the history of Chicago. Can you fold in maybe your comments to that as you respond?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here today discussing important topics like inequality, and I'd like to commend folks of French origin for chiming in with two important works, the Piketty book on capitalism in the 21st century that I think gives us an understanding of the global marketplace and how it is impacting cities and real people all over the world. And then, of course, Andrew Diamond's book, which we hope will be in English within the next 6 months ago. It will be after the election, but we'll try to get as much information out as possible, Andrew, to folks in Chicago. This is a very timely subject because I think people in the city, people all over America, are struggling in the wake of the Great Recession of 2008 and are trying to figure out, have we lost all of our power to make a difference, improving the quality of life through government? What is the role of public institutions in the life of everyday people, of ordinary people, of poor people? And what about electoral politics? Is it worth it or is it not worth it? I think that some of these questions about poverty and the racialization of politics, an important characteristic of Chicago history and politics are very, very important, and the conversation is very timely. To add to this, we had another interesting publication that was released over a year ago by Kari Leiderson, who focused on the concentration of wealth and mayors who are implementing what is perceived to be as a corporate agenda that is further concentrating wealth in the hands of a few people, and those few people are also moving into the electoral realm, especially since the Supreme Court has given free rein to them to influence politics greatly, infuse large amounts of cash into politics, and it's affecting the outcome of those politics. Some would argue it's keeping people away from the ballot box, feeling that they're overwhelmed and that only the elite can play politics. Only the elite decide how to spin, they can foretell results, and they can install their people to manage cities and states and even the National Congress in the manner they would like it to function, basically to help very wealthy people make more wealth and accumulate massive amounts of wealth. So Chicago, as Mr. Diamond has shared with us, has a long history of racial politics, and in that racial politics, tools of suppression. One of the most written about aspects of this suppression has been how the governing elite have used redistricting or gerrymandering to stifle empowerment of people of color. Much has been written about the African American experience, but there's also a Latino experience with regard to this, particularly as the Latino population grew in Chicago during the 60s and 70s, throughout the 80s and the 90s. But one case in point during the 70s, I know Don Rose here surely remembers, was in the Humboldt Park community, when the community was significantly ethnically Puerto Rican in around 1971, before the new map was drawn for the city of Chicago. Clearly, a ward could have been drawn to permit or the possibility of electing a Latino from that ward, a Puerto Rican man or woman. Instead, it was chopped up into 4 different wards to enable that to happen, to prevent the possibility of a Latina or a Latino being elected. Part of the reason it happened was the Voting Rights Act needed to be tweaked with greater protection, something that Harold Washington managed to do after he was elected to Congress in 1980, whereupon in the 80s, when the ward map was challenged pursuant to constitutional provisions stemming from the Voting Rights Act, it was only then that minorities got a fair shake in Chicago. It coincided with the election of 2 progressive aldermen with the Washington side block. That was during the Council Wars period of Chicago's very racialized period of politics during the 80s, whereupon I was elected, Luis Gutierrez was elected to the city council, 2 other progressives were elected, and that gave Harold Washington the 25 votes needed to have a majority on the city council. He cast a tie-breaking vote in his favor, and that ended council wars, and it ushered in a new period where the mayor could again try, returning to the subject matter at hand here, the prime one, which is to try to deal with inequality, to try to figure out strategies linking the prosperity in the city center with the fate of neighborhoods throughout Chicago, particularly the most disinvested. That led to a significant development, which was the largest investment of infrastructure funding for aged infrastructure all over the city of Chicago, the General Obligation Bond Deal of 1987, that was the beginning of a reinvestment in neighborhood infrastructure. So that's sort of how it plays, but the larger question of inequality continues to tug at us, particularly as we look at what occurred in New York and how New York went against the grain and elected an unlikely candidate to be its mayor. I think so Chicago is grappling with a similar challenge that takes all of these things into account, not to advance a particular preference that I may have with respect to the upcoming contest, but certainly one that will raise many issues about can we change courses moving forward for the city of Chicago, and in light of global market forces and the freedom that capital has had to move and to accumulate wherever it seeks to do so, what's the fate of neighborhoods, particularly the most disinvested, over the next 4 years, and as we move forward in the global city, the Tier 1 global city that is the city of Chicago.
Thank you, Commissioner. Professor Lippman.
Good morning. Mic down. I have notes scribbled all over here. So many things to say. I wanted to start out by saying that I also really appreciate Andrew's historical perspective. I think that we look at Chicago today and we forget that the dual city that we live in, the city of glittering luxury zones and disinvested neighborhoods, especially African American and some Latino neighborhoods, is really built on a whole history of development, both economic development and racial politics and class politics. So it really takes place on the terrain of that's already been plowed by racial segregation, deindustrialization, and it's really created the ideological and cultural groundwork over decades for the kind of neoliberal global city that we see today. So I think that's right on point, and we really need to understand this more historically. You know, sometimes people ask me, how did Detroit turn out the way it turned out and Chicago turned out the way it turned out? And that's actually a very complicated question, and there are many aspects to it. But one aspect, I think, is the way in which the first Mayor Daley focused on downtown development and the sort of growth model of the downtown, which positioned then Chicago to be a global city and compete for global capital in a way that Detroit did not. It's just one aspect of it. So, you know, I think probably a lot of us have read the piece by Ta-Nehisi Coates in The Atlantic on the case for reparations. If you haven't, you should read that piece. Came out this year. And I think when we read that piece, that we see a really powerful kind of instantiation of some of what Andrew is talking about. The way in which specific African American communities in this city were redlined, racially segregated, where contract buying was the norm, that created the conditions for, one, the lack of accumulation of black wealth through home ownership, the racially segregated housing, which then was coupled with the disinvestment in the 1960s and 70s, and really produced the conditions that we see today in places like North Lawndale on the west side of Chicago. And this is very germane to schools as well, which is what I study. I study the relationship between schools and these broader processes. So if we look at the areas in the city today where many schools have been closed, most neighborhood schools have been closed, that are dotted with these chains of charter schools giving students a subpar education, schools, areas of the city that we call school deserts. Where we see those areas are in some of the very areas that Coates is talking about, this whole historical process of racial segregation. So I think this is a very powerful and important analysis. I also wanted to say something about the point that you made about public housing being a depopulation strategy, and that is very much true. But I think it's not only a depopulation strategy, it's a gentrification strategy. And it's the coupling of the logics of race and the logics of capital that are really important for us to understand in terms of what is happening in the city. And also, which I'm going to get to in a minute, what I see as the current political conflict that's going on. So race has been very central to Chicago's politics and economic development, to the dismantling of public housing, closing schools, and gentrification. All that has been grounded in the cultural politics of race, ideologically. It's been grounded in the demonization and pathologization of African American communities in particular. If those public housing projects had poor white people in them, they would be standing today. They wouldn't actually have been built that way to begin with. So we really can't decouple these logics that are taking place, which means that when we try to think about how do we fix this, how do we transform this, we have to think about the two of them together. Let's see. So Andrew is also right, I think, where I agree with him, I should say, about the de-democratizing effects of neoliberal forms of governance. So since we live in Chicago, most of us, I'm assuming in this room, we don't need to be told about this because we're living it. We know what it means to go to phony school closing hearings, to go to phony public housing hearings, to go to phony zoning hearings. We know what it means that decisions are made by public-private partnerships behind closed doors through managerial logics that don't involve us. But I think that one of the things that, and he also talks about the effects of racial and ethnic divisions, which I want to say something about. But I think maybe that one thing that Andrew's analysis misses, or maybe it stops with, at the American Historical Society conference, when was that, in the spring or something? Which is actually where we met. That Andrew was saying, well, I've written this book and I have to draw a line somewhere. Like every week you want to write another chapter, right? But you have to draw a line. So maybe it's where it stops with the present situation. Because I think that this de-democratization has actually been one of the main factors producing the current social movement that we see emerging in Chicago today. What we have today is not just de-democratization. We have coercive neoliberal governance. We have the state abandonment of black communities, austerity politics, and stunning inequalities that have actually produced an emerging social movement in Chicago that from a bird's eye view you don't see, but from a ground view with all its complexities and difficulties is really happening on the ground. And so examples of this are the Chicago Teachers Union, which you mentioned. It's not just that we had a strike, teacher strike in Chicago that, which was not about a contract fundamentally. It was fundamentally about challenging these neoliberal education policies in Chicago and nationally. But bigger than that, people on the street said they're privatizing the schools and they're privatizing the parking meters, that it was about the whole privatization agenda in the city. And that's because we have a teachers union that's a social movement teachers union, which is setting an example looked to around the country. And we also have the leadership of a growing coalition of African American and Latino community organizations. So we see this in things like Take Back Chicago, in the Grassroots Education Movement Coalition, in the kinds of mergings that are beginning to take place between what's happening in schools and school closings and contesting that, and the fight for $15 an hour minimum wage, for example.
Thank you.
Yeah. So just to conclude, I think, because I obviously got that signal, I think that
Only because I've got these great questions waiting here.
I think that this movement is denaturalizing the idea of autocratic mayors. I don't think it's naturalized anymore. And so I think that while there is a politics of identity, I think that what's being forged is a powerful unity, not powerful yet, but the potential of a powerful unity across racial and ethnic identities.
Thank you, Professor. Victor.
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me here. And I'd like to thank Great Cities Institute for this conversation that hopefully will lead to some transformation in our city. And thanks to Professor Diamond. One of the things that strikes me about what you've written is that all of us as voters, as citizens, really, almost have to translate the things that we hear from politicians, because what sounds like something that might be good for us actually has been very detrimental. And, we tend to vote, straight line party, and it's obvious that the politics of party really doesn't matter. I mean, we really need to understand exactly what the policies will do and what's behind the policies that people are implementing. So hopefully we'll figure out how to get all of our elected officials to read your material and understand it and make sure they're making the right kind of decisions. I think, I just feel like, this situation is not going to change until, we also deal with just the simple morality of what we've done and what we continue to do. And, can we appeal in some way to the conscience of the community, the residents who may have been driven more by fear and this zero-sum thinking, that if one ethnic group actually advances and progresses or becomes equal, it means we will lose. And that zero-sum mentality produces all sorts of fear. And so I'm reminded of this, the Bible verse that says there's no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves torment. So when people react based on these unfounded fears, they do things that produces torment in the lives of other people. And that's what we've seen happen in our city. The conversation is good. I'm hopeful that we will move from conversation to actually putting together some sort of plan of action, because the situation is dire. And while we are here talking, people are suffering and dying because of the circumstances that they're in. And so this urgency is kind of what drives me. Understanding that 32% of blacks here in this city are in poverty, that 44% of black children are living in poverty, that 50% of young black men ages 16 to 24 are unemployed, and that we have now multiple generations of people who've been dealing with the consequence and the cumulative impact and effect of crime and violence, of stress and poverty. And so now we need a real serious investment in these communities, and it needs to happen on multiple levels. It needs to happen on an individual family level, because individuals, we don't have time. It's taken decades, almost 100 years of building this system that's locked people out of the economy and segregated them into poor communities. It may take 50 years to unravel this and undo it, but we don't have time for that. So while we work on systemic changes, we need to invest in individuals and invest in families, a multi-generational investment that gives that individual the opportunity to move up and potentially move out. People need to be trained. There are jobs that are open that people have no skill for, that they can be trained to do. They need income supports to help them get above the poverty level and help them get above minimum wage. They may need transitional public supported jobs to help them. They need child care. They need transportation to make things accessible for them. There's so many things that are needed by people today, right now. And so there needs to be that investment in families and individuals, for men and women, for single and married, and that's what's needed in our community, and it's needed right now. While we work on more structural changes, more durable, as Sharkey in his book Stuck in Place talked about, a durable urban policy and durable urban investments that last multiple generations, that can outlive political changes and outlive economic downturns. Those are the kind of things that we need, a short-term plan and a long-term plan. We've had a war on drugs now for more than 30 years. And our country, when we've been a part of fighting wars, we've bombed Iraq and gone in and rebuilt the infrastructure. We fought a war in Europe, and we had a Marshall Plan to go in and rebuild, but we've had a war on drugs, on the communities, on the neighborhoods, and the urban cities of America. Where's the Marshall Plan for our cities right now? Where's the long-term investment to rebuild our cities? I mean, you don't hear anybody talking about that. You know, we had programs in the Depression, like a WPA, a jobs program, that whites took advantage of, public jobs. Where's the WPA program now for the significant unemployment that exists in our community? And then we've had mass incarceration, which I was hoping that Professor Diamond, you would have touched on, because now we have millions of people. Here in Illinois, we have 2.8 million people with a criminal record that when they go to apply for a job, it pops up on a background check, and they're prevented from getting jobs. They're prevented from moving into public housing. They're prevented from getting financial aid going to colleges. They're totally locked out of professions like healthcare, the fastest growing industry in our country, completely locked out. And so, you know, what are we doing, you know, to deal with those issues? What are we going to do to deal with the millions of people, 2.8 million people in Illinois, in a state that only has 12.8 million people in the whole state, almost 1/3 of our population facing barriers to entering our society and being contributing members of society. So, to me, part of what has to happen involves our politics and our leaders, but part of it involves everyday people in our communities that really need to decide, does this make sense? Does it really make sense to lock out almost 1/3 of our population from being contributing members of our society? Who does that really benefit? Who does it benefit when they have no alternatives but to do things that we consider antisocial and criminal? I mean, who benefits from that? So I would urge all of us to really, look deep into our hearts. We've got to find somewhere love that overcomes fear, because fear drives decisions that create the kind of mess that we have, and now it's going to take decades for us to fix.
Thank you, Victor. Commissioner Garcia, there are fiscal implications, are there not, of these policies of mass incarceration?
There sure are. In Illinois and Chicago, in the same boat with the state of Illinois, we have a very bad structural setup that produces the inequalities that we see in our school system, where much of what we experience in the form of incarceration, in the form of crime on the street, in the form of disinvested schools versus the good schools that the system has to offer. It's, 2 or 3 tiers of public school education. It's rooted in the structural deficit that we get from the over-reliance on property taxes to fund the most essential things in life. Those would be the right to an education, the right to health care, the right to basic human services that certain people in society need. Poor people, people with disabilities, veterans, people with mental health, to mention a few of those. And we won't get out of this predicament unless we amend our state constitution to have a different system of taxation. We're over-relying on property taxes. We need to change it and to have a graduated state income tax. That is a progressive system of taxation. The urban crisis is exacerbated by this structural situation, the structural framework that we operate in there, making us always scrambling, always being played off, one group against another. The politics that, suggest a downward spiral that breeds fear of the other, that creates racial tensions, and that constantly has people in one part of the city, in one community of identity, being suspect of another group. So I believe that at the root of this structural deficit that we have is what produces some of the worst situations in neighborhoods, and that's the crime rates and incarceration rates, many other pathologies that are attributable to the lack of equal opportunity, the lack of fairness and equity that exists in our society in Illinois. Illinois is not in the same boat, but states that have a different system of taxation do not experience the challenges that we experience here.
Fantastic. So I have in front of me an array of really great questions, so I'm going to get to as many of them as I can. Some of them I'll summarize. I guess one, I think it's raised as a question, but I'm going to frame it really, I think, more as a point, and if anybody wants to expand on it, you can, which is that we've talked a lot about poverty, or you all have talked a lot about poverty in terms of income, and shouldn't we also include it as issues of accumulated wealth as well? And I don't know, Victor, I see you not, if you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I think, there are some movements, particularly over in Europe and in England and Spain, the Mangredon Worker Cooperative Corporation, for example, is one that's been around for almost 60 years now, where workers are owners of companies that are very competitive in the global market. They share in the management of those companies. They share in the profits. And I was reading something the other day that said they've weathered economic downturns and not had a single person laid off in over 56 years because of the way they have a participatory management. So there's not people sucking out the profits at the top of the corporation, and they can reinvest, and they have money to be able to weather economic storms. So there's some models, that are out there for really looking at things and doing things very differently, transformative in terms of enabling people to build wealth. They're on a smaller scale. Some of that's being done here in the States, like in Cleveland with Evergreen Cooperatives, where people, who are in inner city, poor communities are being hired into companies, becoming owners of those companies, and developing real wealth that they can transfer on to their family. To me, that's the only possibility of really changing this situation, is a different model of how we do economic development, and being willing to understand that it's not inconsistent with capitalism. Because once again, the cooperatives in Europe, and particularly in Spain, compete in the marketplace head-to-head with other for-profit companies, and they do quite well. So there should be no argument for people who believe in free market competition.
Well, I'm glad for that comment, because besides the fact that yesterday at Great Cities Institute we actually hosted a event around worker cooperatives, and much of what you say was elaborated upon and discussed as a very important and viable way to organize economic activities. But I also appreciate your comments, because one of the questions here I have is people. Someone asked to hear some actually Essence McDonald. I love your name, right? She asked, what are some of the realistic, straightforward solutions to ending inequality and segregation? So I think you've already started articulating some of those answers. But along those lines, somebody also asked about how, for example, do you, Professor Diamond, incorporate into your analysis the impact of all the loss of industrial jobs, the decline of manufacturing? So I think not only thinking about what are the impacts of that loss, but what can we be doing about it now? Professor Diamond, why don't you try that one first?
I do incorporate that into my analysis, and a very important part of the analysis, and it's an important part of the story that we're telling here today, is that, if you look at history, what starts to happen in the 1950s and it starts to accelerate in the 60s and 70s is this process of deindustrialization, where Chicago, which was an industrial city that produced things, much like Gary and Detroit nearby, loses this industrial base, and the children of those who worked in these industrial jobs are now faced with a very different kind of job market, one in which services jobs, and I mentioned the fire sector, finance, insurance, real estate, are driving the economy. And the problem there is that we haven't done a good job at dealing with that situation. The fact that there's a mismatch between the skills that, and I think that Professor Lippman could talk a little bit about how the schools have really kind of failed in some ways equipping these new generations to negotiate those new conditions and those new job markets.
Great. Did anyone want to add to that? Professor Lippman?
Yeah. Sorry, you can probably hear me. It's a swinging microphone. So on the point about the accumulation of wealth and the concentration of poverty, they're of course interrelated, right? It is precisely because of the extreme accumulation of wealth that we actually have so much poverty. And so one aspect of that is that when we see what's happened to the city is about the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few. That's what's driving much of what's happening in the city. So at the same time, we have, as you said, in relation to schools, we have disinvested schools, we have disinvested neighborhoods, and we have a real need for economic development and jobs. And so I think we need both policies like Jean Anyon who just passed recently, a very important education sociologist, said that what should count as education policy is wage policy, is affordable housing policy, is good transportation, is high-quality health care available to everyone. So what we really need is policies in the city like a living wage, $15 an hour to start with. We need building much high-quality, affordable housing. We need cooperative economic development and the infrastructure and the support to do that in neighborhoods. These are that can produce good jobs, and we need to raise the minimum wage after all across the board. I think the other piece in terms of where is the money going to come from is, we hear about how we're broke, all this austerity politics, but we're not broke. It's just that all the money is in a few hands. So Chicago has the most financial transactions of any center in the world when you merge the Mercantile Exchange and the Board of Trade. Just a tiny tax on those financial transactions, on each financial transaction, would generate, and we did some calculations, billions of dollars that could fund schools and that could begin to fund some of these projects. So I think we have to look at the relationship between those two things and develop policies that redistribute that wealth.
Mr. Rose.
Yeah, I certainly agree about the financial transactions tax. As a matter of fact, we probably need it nationally to begin to build it. The answers to a lot of these questions have been out there for ages. It sort of reminds me of how are we going to settle the Israeli-Palestinian question? Everybody knows the solutions. It's a matter of who's going to agree to do it. Raising the minimum wage will go part way. We have to get more. We could, in the state of Illinois, without a constitutional change, maintain the concept of the flat rate tax by simply making it a flat rate of your income tax, of your federal income tax. Your federal income tax is graduated, and if we passed a law that said the flat rate should be tied to a certain percentage of your income tax, you will perforce, without having to go to the almost impossible concept of a constitutional referendum. Another thing that we need is stronger unions. Deunionization is probably the main reason why we have what we're calling now a wageless recovery. We have a jobless recovery to some extent because there are structural problems related to globalization and mechanization and digitization. But what is going to, there are piles of money backing up there. You look at almost every business and they're stacking up the money and they're not spending it. And the only thing that is going to force them to spend it are unions, except that we have, since the Wagner Act of '36, they started in '47 with Taft-Hartley to destroy or degrade unions, and that's why most of the unions today, the biggest unions, are public service unions, public employee unions, and the number of other unions is down to a pitiful level, 8 or 9%. We have to raise those unions up. We almost passed a measure, almost passed a measure called card check, which would have made it, in the early years of the Obama administration, which would have made it much easier to unionize. But they keep throwing chairs in the way of every bit of unionization. But unions are the only method, short of a simple redistribution, that are going to raise wages. And the other thing we really have to think about, again, something that was up in the 60s and is even more necessary now, is a redistribution to a minimum guaranteed income. The money is out there. The question is, who is going to do it? The Israelis or the Palestinians?
Well,
Can I?
yeah, go ahead.
You know, the comment about the unions, the only thing I would add to that is hopefully if there is a resurgence of unions, the unions do not become a barrier to African Americans and Latinos getting good jobs, because in the past that's been an issue. They have not, they've blocked in many cases jobs going to people of color. And so that's an issue that really has to be resolved, you know, if that's truly going to help with the problem we're talking about today, which is a race-based poverty. So.
Similarly,
Just one moment.
Go ahead,
I
Mr. Rose.
think if you look at the ethnicity of unions today, I think you're talking about a problem, not totally of the past, but largely of the past.
Understood, yeah. We just don't want to go back to the past.
But we need a different kind of union. We need unions that are allied with communities and that fight against racial inequality as part of the central platform. We need stronger unions, but we need a new kind of union. We need social movement unions.
Okay, here's a question for you all. This is from Mike Rolfs, Director of Renew Chicago. Welcome, Mike. Prosperous cities, he says, can afford good schools, safe streets, and affordable housing. Poor cities can only promise the poor shared misery. Assuming corporations and individuals have the mobility to move here or move away from here, how does public policy balance the compelling interests of A, fostering an attractive business climate, and B, pursuing a just and fair society? Who wants to take that one? Go ahead, Commissioner.
Great cities need great neighborhoods. I think there is a growing sense in Chicago that if one part of the city is insecure, if one part of the city suffers from violence, that violence is likely to be mobile and thus threaten everyone in the city of Chicago, whether you're riding the L, the bus, having a good time at the park, wherever, you are not safe. So I think there are more people who understand the interdependency of the city center that has seen so much prosperity and the neighborhoods. It's a great time in Chicago to have a debate about a new relationship with respect to that prosperity. There are many opportunities in economic development, especially in some of the poorest neighborhoods in Chicago where there are large tracts of land for things like urban agriculture and aquaponics, to teach young people in particular the basics of sustainability and ecology and farming and how to make a good living and how to produce to be self-sufficient. I think that's part of a new covenant that has to be arrived at through a democratic conversation about what equity and sustainability and fairness is all about. I believe that what we've learned about the growing disparities between the wealthy in Chicago, the middle class, the working class, and very poor people, everyone understands that we cannot have a great city unless we have healthy neighborhoods everywhere in Chicago. I think there's a new disposition on the part of many people across race, across geography, across lines of faith to build a new Chicago, and I think the time is great to engage in a profound conversation about it, but at the root of it has to be democracy, respect, and mutual trust to advance all of the city, 100% of the city.
Professor Diamonds, here's a question for you. Have you considered in your analysis Chicago's political leadership under a gender perspective? So can you describe any interesting findings or hypotheses?
I haven't considered that issue greatly. I mean, I talk about Jane Burns, of course, the election of the first female mayor. But that question throws me a bit. I think that I really don't have a good response to this question. It's quite embarrassing. I mean, I haven't really looked at that. I guess just say that I haven't really looked at that issue of the sort of gender perspective of the institution of the mayor too much, you know. So.
Well, part of the question also becomes, you know, for all of you, right? What is the role of women in all of this? When women are present, what difference does that make? And I don't know if any of you want to take that on in particular. I think we've been talking about people in general, right? And so if we bring to that the notion of women, does that change our analysis?
Let me
in
take
any
a
way?
stab at it, okay, without prepping things so much. You know, the city council for a long time was an all-men's club. You know, there were very few women. Women didn't get elected to the city council since Anna Langford until the 80s and then the 90s and subsequently. Men have really messed up government for a long, long time. That's a fact. And people who do gender studies can, I'm totally confident, can verify that in very clear ways. It took a woman to run for Cook County board president and get elected to put Cook County government on a solid footing over the past 4 years. I think the presence of women in policymaking, and I think one of the most important gains that women made in any administration was during the tenure of Harold Washington, when they were appointed to many, many positions where they had not been before. Other people who had been shut out of government also. But I think that the presence of women brings a whole dimension of debate that doesn't play into some of the traditional ways of male dominance in a society and the way that things have worked for so long. There is a greater awareness about family, about making ends meet, about realities that women have to put up with, sexual harassment being, you know, a profound one that has only really taken, you know, a consciousness about sexual harassment in the workplace has really been elevated so much over the past 15 years, I would say, in particular. So where you have women being at the table in decision-making circles, you tend to have more thoughtful, comprehensive public policies being decided. We need more women in city council, county board, state legislature, and the federal Congress, obviously, too.
Mr. Dixon and then Mr. Rose.
Yeah.
You know, I think about the area that we work in at SAFER and with people with criminal records. Right now, African American men, 1 out of 3 will be incarcerated in their lifetime. 1 out of 3. And so that means fathers away from their children, husbands away from their wives, sons away from their mothers. And I think that women, you know, bring a sensitivity to that issue. So I would love to see more women engage because they are directly involved and sometimes suffering the consequences when the income is ripped out of their households and they're left to deal with that. That's what happens when people are incarcerated and at the rate that we're dealing with. It's a substantial issue in our communities. So hopefully women will bring a very forceful voice to some of these issues because of the impact that it has on them.
If I can take a bow for having elected the first and only woman mayor of Chicago. I have to say that I don't think it was a successful mayoralty, but it has been a widely denigrated term of office, largely sexist. Most of the objections that were put up against Jane Byrne, and now she made a lot of bad moves, but she made some good moves which we're forgetting. And, you know, somebody from the university here wrote a book about the worst mayors of Chicago, and Jane Byrne came out on the bottom, which is just the biggest lie you can imagine. But maybe we'll have a woman president next year. But I would like to say that when women are in office, they still suffer from a great deal of sexism, no matter who or when they are.
Pauline, Professor
Yeah,
Whitman?
I just, I'd actually not like to talk much about women as representatives in office, but more about how these issues actually affect women, which is, I think, what you were talking about. So the topics we're talking about inequality, the inequality in the city is experienced by women in very concrete ways. It's experienced in their bodies. It's experienced in the homes. It's experienced. Women are often the ones who are responsible for trying to figure out how to put food on the table when there isn't money. That they're responsible for taking their children to the doctor when they don't have health care. That if we look at the outrage against the education policies in Chicago, we see that the majority of people involved have in fact been women. When we look at poverty, we see that poverty is feminized. So that the issues that we're talking about are in every case gendered, which means that we need a whole set of policies. We don't just need more women in office. We need a whole set of policies that deal with actually free health care, to reinstate the mental health clinics, that the education policies that we're calling for, sustainable, high quality, public neighborhood schools in every neighborhood, would greatly relieve the stress that many women feel. So I think we need to think in those terms. And I also want to say that I think this is correct, that the fastest growing population in prisons is black women. So black women are experiencing all of these things, and it's a very concentrated way. So we need a set of gender policies that really address the ways in which women and their families are affected.
Well, Professor Diamond, from the view in Paris, are there things going on there to address some of these issues? Because we know that this is not, the issues we're talking about here aren't particularly, not just unique to Chicago, right? There's issues of austerity and there's issues of poverty that are expanding worldwide. Do you have any insights from the view from Paris, things going on there? You've talked about this perhaps being a cautionary tale on what not to do. What are some of the things happening there?
Well, I think it's interesting to think about, well, my experience in writing this, finishing this book. I mean, the research was obviously done here, but in finishing this book in Paris and the sort of project evolving there, where you have in France, well, should we say, the specter of racial politics. And it's very much, there's a lot of resistance to that. In France, there's a very heartfelt embrace of the idea of republicanism, the idea that French citizens are nothing else but French citizens before the law. And France doesn't have the same legacies of de facto racial discrimination and de jure racial discrimination. And yet we have, of course, great problems of racial discrimination in France today. And what's interesting here is that there's a lot of fear in France of what the French call communautarisme, which is communitarism, communities. What I've described happened in Chicago in the 1960s and 1970s, communities mobilizing behind ethno-racial identities and the city becoming a sort of balkanized, divided place. And that is kind of, that was, in 2005 when you had riots in France, which was really the sort of awakening to the problem of race in France, you had a lot of discourse about, well, this is coming here. We have this American problem. And there's this French gaze across the Atlantic that I think works to deny the same kinds of problems that are here. And when I was writing the book, I was quite aware of that. So there was a moment when I was writing about public housing in Chicago and the removal, what Baldwin called Negro removal, the removal of African Americans. And I'm understanding at that moment that my audience, and this is why the book isn't coming out yet in the United States, because I have to sort of readapt it, because it was adapted to France, because I understood that people in France were that gaze was occurring, and that I needed to say, well, you know, in France at this very same moment, you know, public housing projects are being constructed in the suburbs around Paris. It's a different issue in the sense that public housing is being constructed outside the city, whereas, you know, the State Street corridor was right in the heart of the city. But that is a really fundamental dimension of this kind of transatlantic story of this book is first of all, the politics of race, but also a lot of what we're talking about here, embracing the state and trying to figure out what government can do to serve people in their daily lives. I believe in France, that is still a stronger ethos. That's people invest in the state in ways that we don't hear. Although that is, you know, in France there's an expression, service public, you know, public service, which is still something that is very, if you look at the way people speak, it's very important in French political culture. People talk about service public when they talk about the schools, when they talk about all sorts of issues that affect the city. And so I guess the cautionary tale is that, you know, retain this idea and don't give up on the state and its ability to, you know, to solve problems.
I have 3 remaining questions, which I don't have time to get to. One involved campaign finance reform, and others on the questions around race, which much of which I think was covered.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the final thing I'll say is to kind of tip my cap at Teresa and the Great Cities Institute. I think this is I think this is part of what is needed to start changing things. You know, and I'm somebody who works in the university, and I believe in the university, and I think the university most recently has lost its direction in terms of its role in civic life. And I think that this kind of initiative, which brings together professionals and people working on these problems, is superb, and it's the beginning of the process of changing things. So
Thank you.
I just want to say that.
Many cities are struggling with the challenge of inequality. Some cities and locality and some states, I think, have moved further along in terms of being intentional about sharing the prosperity among most citizens and taking affirmative steps to ensure that people aren't left behind. I would suggest that Seattle, King County is one of those localities. Their equity ordinance wants to ensure fair access to citizens, and that means everyone who resides there, not just those who have the right to vote, to remove barriers that have prevented people from getting services, employment, other opportunities. I think it's a significant commitment to greater equity. I would say the state of Minnesota is also a leader in this regard, as well as in terms of regionalism and understanding that new metropolitan areas are interdependent and that you can't play the old game of trying to steal resources from one or lure a corporation from one locality to another for the benefit of that particular area. So I would say in our effort to reduce unemployment, to create better schools, to ensure that we lift everyone up, equity is the struggle of the future, one that if we're going to create a fairer society, a more just society, we have to go down that path. And I think Chicago is at a crossroads with respect to its future in that regard.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Rose.
I want to take a single issue, and I think it's among the most important, along with economics, and that's schools. We have to break this concept called school reform, which involves mayoral control of the schools, dependence on standardized testing on which both students and teachers are based, and the production of charter schools. Our kids are over-tested and under-educated. Their teachers are unfairly judged, and it is largely the fault of the mayoral control. We have to go to something like an elected school board for equity, And we have to drop the technocratic approach of standardized testing. The people who've been in charge of education in this town, whether you're talking about Arnie Duncan or Paul Vallis or whoever is here now, are not educators, they're technocrats, because testing is the technocratic way of judging. And it is full of crap, and until we break that, stop the testing and start the educating, we are not going to be able to develop the people or have the teachers we need to make this a serious education city.
Wow. I'm sitting here smiling because Don just stole every one of my lines. I agree 100%. And what I would just add is that I think that to get to that place and to get to a similar place in terms of the other issues that we're facing, that we're really at a critical moment in Chicago. That I think it is a product of the history that Andrew has laid out, but we're really at a critical moment. And I think that people really are tired of Mayor 1%. They're really tired of an appointed school board. They're really tired of these policies. They're really tired of a dual city, a dual school system. And what I think we're all looking for is bold, new directions that really set a different course for Chicago. And I think that if we get that we will be able to move forward. But we need to challenge these fundamental questions. We need to challenge the question of, is this going to be a city for a few of the rich, of the super rich, or are we going to redirect our policies to the majority of people and to the neighborhoods? And so I think that's, it's really a critical moment. And we really have an opportunity in Chicago to set an example nationally. And it's really a question of, it's really being up to us. So I think it's a very exciting moment in Chicago right now.
You know, I work every day in the space where we're dealing with 30,000 people every year that are released from prisons in Illinois. About 25 to 30% of those people come back to Chicago, to 7 neighborhoods on the west side and the south side of the city. We have about 76,000 people every year that exit from Cook County Jail. And those people coming from prison and jail have something on their record that now prevents them from getting a job, taking care of their families, from going to school, from living in public housing, from doing all the things that most of us take for granted. And I don't know how we get over these issues and challenges and get to the point where we really can break down barriers, stop the discrimination, and invest in people until we get over our fears of people, and until we get to the point where the politics of race is not, and the politics of fear is not the thing that's driving our decisions and our choices of the people that we elect. So I would hope that we would all kind of look into our hearts and really understand that people need a chance, and they just need a second chance. And if we would do that, they would become law-abiding, contributing members of our society, and the whole city would improve.
I want to again thank the Institut Français in Paris and the Cultural Services at the Consulate General of France, and I also want to thank the Great Cities Institute staff and all of you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, panelists. We really appreciate it. Professor Diamond, thank you for making your journey across the sea to be with us here today. Thank you so much.